man of science. Dr. John Duong had spent years peering into microscopes, poring over genetic sequences, and unraveling the enigmatic nature of Zero Doom. A man of unwavering determination and intellect, he had come to understand the virus more intimately than anyone else on the planet. Yet, his knowledge brought him no solace, only a harrowing sense of helplessness that gnawed at his soul. In his lab, amid rows of test tubes, the hum of complex machinery, and the sterile scent of antiseptics, John Duong witnessed the tragedy unfold before his very eyes. The lab, once a place of discovery and hope, had become a theater of despair, where the worst fears of humanity were confirmed daily. Families, shattered and bewildered, brought their afflicted loved ones to seek answers from him. These once vibrant individuals now resembled innocent children, devoid of the memories and experiences that once defined their lives. The heart-wrenching scenes etched deep furrows on Dr. Duong's brow as he grappled with the implications of his findings. The virus's cunning cloak of invisibility made it an insurmountable adversary. There was no fever to break, no symptoms to treat, no enemy to combat directly. It was as though the virus was mocking the very foundations of medical science, slipping through its grasp with ease. One evening, after hours of exhaustive research, Dr. Duong sat in his office, his head resting heavily in his hands. The lab was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the equipment. The day's work had left him drained, both physically and emotionally. "John, you need to take a break," said Dr. Elise Patel, his longtime colleague and confidant, as she entered the room. Her voice was gentle, but her concern was palpable. "I can't, Elise," he replied without looking up. "How can I rest when the world is falling apart?" Elise sighed and pulled up a chair beside him. "You've been at this for weeks, John. You need to take care of yourself too." "I've tried everything," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Every test, every experiment, leads to the same dead end. Zero Doom is unlike anything we've ever encountered. It's rewriting the genetic code of its hosts, but in such a subtle way that it leaves no trace of its presence. It's as if it was designed to be undetectable." Elise reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure this out, John. We have to. But you're no good to anyone if you burn out." John finally looked up, his eyes weary but determined. "I know, Elise. I know. But every day we don't find an answer, more people lose themselves to this monstrosity." She nodded, understanding the weight he bore. "We'll find a way. We have to keep pushing forward. For their sake." John offered a weak smile. For their sake. The White House invitation. The next day, as John was deep in his research, a call came through that would change the course of his life. The President of the United States had requested his presence at the White House. The nation's leaders were desperate for answers, and they were pinning their hopes on Dr. Duong's expertise. As he traveled to Washington, D.C., the weight of the responsibility he bore pressed down on him like a leaden cloak. The country, and perhaps the world, looked to him for solutions, but he had none to offer. The virus was not just a medical anomaly, it was a force that defied the very principles of biology, a scourge that laughed in the face of human ingenuity. Upon arriving at the White House, John was ushered into a private meeting room. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the unspoken dread that permeated the highest echelons of power. The president, a man usually known for his calm demeanor and resolute leadership, now wore a mask of exhaustion and anxiety. He rose from his seat as Dr. Duong entered the room, extending a hand. "Dr. Duong, thank you for coming on such short notice," the president said, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "Mr. President," John replied, shaking his hand. "It's an honor to be here, though I wish the circumstances were different." The president gestured for him to sit, and they both took their seats at the large conference table. Around them, top officials from the administration, including the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the National Security Advisor, and the Director of the CDC, watched in silence. "We've been following your work closely, Dr. Duong," the president began, his tone formal but tinged with desperation. "You are, without question, the foremost expert on Zero Doom. The American people, and indeed, the world, are looking to you for answers. What can you tell us? John took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to say. Mr. President, I have dedicated my life to understanding Zero Doom. It's a virus unlike any we've encountered. Its insidious nature lies in its very subtlety. It evades detection because it causes no harm that we can detect. It's changing the fundamental genetic makeup of those it infects. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a dense fog. The president's expression hardened as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on John. And what does that mean for those who are infected? He asked, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. John hesitated for a moment before responding. It means, Mr. President, that the virus is altering them at the core of their being. It's not just affecting their health, it's rewriting who they are. Their memories, their identities, their very sense of self, everything is being erased, replaced by a blank slate. And there's nothing we can do to stop it. The president's face contorted with a mixture of frustration and desperation. But surely there must be something, some way to slow it down, to reverse the effects? John shook his head slowly, the weight of his helplessness pressing down on him. We've tried everything, Mr. President. The virus alters the very core of human genetics, rewriting it silently, without a trace. There's no medicine, no vaccine that can destroy it without destroying the host. The president leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he processed the gravity of what he had just heard. The room remained silent, the reality of the situation sinking in. After a long pause, the president spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. And what does this mean for the future? For the world? John looked down at his hands, the words he had to say heavy with the weight of the truth. It means, Mr. President, that this virus is changing the course of civilization. It's rewriting the narrative of humanity, and there seems to be no turning back. If we can't find a way to stop it, we may be witnessing the end of the world as we know it. The shattered lives. Back at his lab, John resumed his work with a renewed sense of urgency, but the hopelessness lingered, a constant shadow over his every move. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, yet progress remained elusive. The virus was a phantom, slipping through their fingers at every turn. One afternoon, as John sat at his desk, sifting through yet another batch of inconclusive data, the door to his office swung open. A man and a woman entered, their faces etched with despair. The man held the hand of a young woman who appeared to be in her early 20s, but her vacant stare and childlike demeanor betrayed her condition. Dr. Duong? The man asked, his voice trembling. John looked up, his heart sinking as he recognized the symptoms immediately. Yes, I'm Dr. Duong. Please, have a seat. The couple guided the young woman to a chair and sat down beside her. The woman, her eyes red and swollen from crying, spoke first. This is our daughter, Emily. She was a bright, vibrant young woman. She was studying to be a nurse. But a few months ago, she started to change. She became withdrawn, confused. We didn't understand what was happening. The man squeezed his daughter's hand, his voice thick with emotion. She doesn't remember us anymore, doctor. She doesn't even know who she is. Please, tell us there's something you can do. John's heart ached as he looked at Emily, her once bright eyes now dull and lifeless. I'm so sorry, he began, choosing his words carefully. I wish I had better news, but Zero Doom is unlike any virus we've ever seen. It rewrites the very essence of a person, erasing their memories, their identity. There's no way to reverse the damage once it's done. The woman covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. The man looked at John, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for hope. But there must be something, doctor. Anything. John shook his head, his voice soft with regret. We're doing everything we can to understand this virus, to find a way to stop it. But so far, we've found nothing that can restore what's been lost. The man looked down at his daughter, his shoulders shaking as he struggled to hold back tears. She was our whole world, doctor. What are we supposed to do now? John had no answer for him. The virus had stolen Emily's future, just as it had stolen the futures of countless others. There was nothing left but the hollow shell of what once was. After the couple left, John sat in his office, the echoes of their grief lingering in the air. He had seen this scene play out countless times, and each time it left him feeling more powerless, more hollow. Zero Doom was winning, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The point of no return. As the months wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. Zero Doom continued to spread, its effects devastating entire communities. The world watched in horror as more and more people succumbed to the virus, regressing into childlike states, their identities erased. Governments around the globe scrambled to contain the outbreak, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. One evening, as John was preparing to leave the lab, his phone rang. The caller ID indicated it was Elise. "Elise, what's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "John, you need to get down to the hospital," she replied, her voice urgent. "It's happening faster than we expected. We have a new case, an entire family." John's heart sank. "I'll be there right away." When he arrived at the hospital, Elise met him in the hallway, her expression grim. They were brought in this morning. The parents and two children, both in their teens. The parents were showing the early signs of regression, but the children, they're almost completely gone. John followed Elise to the observation room, where he could see the family through a one-way mirror. The parents, a man and a woman in their 40s, sat on the bed, holding hands and staring blankly ahead. The two teenagers, a boy and a girl, were playing with toys, their behavior indistinguishable from that of small children. "How could this happen so quickly?" John asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "We don't know," Elise replied. "But it seems the virus is accelerating. It's progressing faster in younger people, wiping out their identities in a matter of weeks." John watched the family, his mind racing. If that's true, if the virus is evolving, we may be running out of time. Elise nodded, her face pale. "We need to find a solution, John. Now more than ever." But as John looked at the family, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had already crossed the point of no return. A final plea. As the crisis deepened, the world turned increasingly to Dr. Duong for answers, but there were none to give. The virus was an unstoppable force, spreading through the population like wildfire, leaving devastation in its wake. One day, as John was working in his lab, he received an urgent message from the president. The situation had reached a critical point, and the government was preparing for the worst. "We need to talk, Doctor," the president said as soon as John answered the video call. His face was etched with lines of stress, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "Mr. President, I wish I had better news," John began, already knowing the despair that was evident on the president's face. "We're out of time," the president said bluntly. "The virus is spreading faster than ever, and our projections show that in a matter of months, half the population could be affected. We need solutions, Doctor. Even if they're drastic." John swallowed hard, the weight of the president's words heavy on his shoulders. "There's no cure, Mr. President. Zero Doom is rewriting the very essence of its victims. The changes are irreversible. All we can do is try to slow the spread, but even that may not be enough." The president's face darkened. "Then we're looking at the end of society as we know it. We need to start making contingency plans for the survival of the species." John nodded, understanding the gravity of what the president was suggesting. "I'll do what I can, Mr. President. But you should prepare for the worst." The call ended, leaving John alone in the silence of his lab. The virus had won, and humanity was on the brink of extinction. All that remained was the hope that some remnant of humanity would survive to carry on, even as the world crumbled around them. The unraveling. In the final months, society began to unravel at an alarming rate. Zero Doom's acceleration meant that entire communities were regressing within weeks, leaving behind towns and cities filled with empty shells of the people who once lived there. Governments collapsed under the strain, unable to maintain order in the face of such overwhelming devastation. John watched from his lab as the world he had known crumbled into chaos. There were no more meetings with the president, no more pleas for a solution. The world had accepted its fate, resigned to the fact that Zero Doom would claim them all. Elise was one of the last to succumb. As she sat across from John in the lab, her once sharp mind already beginning to fade, she looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I don't want to forget, John," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose myself." John reached out and took her hand, his heart breaking. "I'll remember for you, Elise. I'll remember everything." She smiled weakly, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, John. For everything." And then, she was gone, her mind slipping away into the abyss, leaving John alone in the empty silence of the lab. The end of the line. As the virus claimed more and more lives, John knew his time was running out. He had dedicated his life to fighting Zero Doom, but in the end, it was an enemy he could not defeat. The virus had won, and humanity was on the brink of extinction. One day, as he sat alone in his lab, the weight of it all finally became too much. He had watched as the world crumbled around him, as the people he loved slipped away into oblivion. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to hope for. With a heavy heart, John made the decision he had been avoiding for so long. He shut down the lab, knowing that there was no more research to be done, no more solutions to be found. Zero Doom had won. As he walked out of the lab for the last time, John felt a strange sense of peace. He had done everything he could, but in the end, it wasn't enough. The virus had rewritten the narrative of humanity, and there was no turning back. As he stepped outside, the world was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, the city silent. Humanity had fallen, leaving behind only the echoes of what once was. John looked up at the sky, the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. There was nothing left to do but accept the inevitable.